everyone could shut off their cameras and mute just to make sure so that we can protect everyone's confidentiality. If anyone is uncomfortable asking a question, um, live, we'll just wait till the end. But during the presentation, if you could put the other questions that you might have in the chat, and we'll answer them as we go, as appropriate. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Plimpton.
Well, hi there, everybody. And it's a real pleasure to have a chance to kind of talk with you. And, I have found, as a parent and also as a kind of clinician, the kind of two things I'd like to kind of emphasize at the outset. First, when it comes to children, it really kind of takes a village. And I think we can all kind of help each other out tremendously by not only the kind of support, but also providing examples about how to kind of talk to our children, or how to talk so our children will listen, and listen so our children will talk. And we each have a different vantage point on kind of children. And I think we each have something kind of unique to offer. I mean, we all have a perspective as a parent, but in the panelists, we have the perspective of a teacher and school administrator, Dana, which has one particular view in which she overviews an entire kind of school and class of children ranging from preschool to sixth grade. And then we have two clinicians that work in a school, and they also have a broad view of kind of children throughout the time spectrum. I have a slightly different perspective, whereas I don't see a group of children. I kind of see one or two children, one child and a family at a time. So that's a different perspective. And of course, pediatricians have an entirely different range as well. They see the entire age spectrum, but in small little units of time. So in any case, we all have something we can kind of learn from our different kind of perspectives. And so I think it's, wonderful that we have a chance to, have Hannah and Dana and Susanna to throw some ideas around. The second very general comment I'm going to kind of make before we leap into some specific issues is, when it comes to dealing with anxious children or kind of anxiety, as a parent and also as a clinician, whenever I get caught up in the urgency of the situation, things do not go well. I think that anxiety is contagious. And if we're going to kind of be helpful to our children, we have to find a way of anchoring ourselves and finding kind of a calm so that we are responding to our children and not reacting. And I mention this because, embarrassingly, I mean, I have been thinking about kind of anxiety in children for 20 years, 25 years. And I am always needing to kind of remind myself to not get caught up in the excitement, and that, unless we've got bleeding or a seizure going on in front of us, it's not an emergency. And I would like everyone to kind of keep in mind that that is also true if you have a child who's having difficulty getting to school and separating from you. Do not try not to get caught up in the urgency that this has to be resolved. And because that sense of urgency is going to kind of make it very hard for you to be present for your child, and for you and your child and the team at school to come up with a creative solution. And I think that anchoring of yourself, I would suggest, if possible, should begin as soon as you wake up and in finding in some way a couple of moments, I know everybody is busy to the max, but even if it's, just a quick mantra to yourself, I've got this, I can do it. Or you can indulge in a cup of coffee or tea before the kids get up, but something to kind of anchor yourself and kind of to get ready for the day. I think whatever small version you can kind of, finagle, I think is kind of really helpful. So, so those would be kind of two general things I would just, like to kind of start with. And, I'd like to kind of just know, from our other participants of, first of all, how's the school year started off? Because you know, there's all this kind of dreadful news that, in the Hampshire Gazette, there was an article in August about the tidal wave of truancy going on. And I'm just kind of curious about how things have started off and um, in your various schools. Hannah, do you have how things started off at the campus school?
Sure, I can start. Well, what I would say is most remarkable is just how every year as we move through this COVID experience has been, I don't want to say a return to normal because I think it's new, but I see a lot of joy. I see teachers who are looking more resourced and energetic. I see parents who are looking more resourced and energetic, and I see kids who are really ready to go. And as always, definitely see kids who are finding that transition from summer into school, into a new classroom or a new teacher, new routine, whatever it is, overwhelming. And I think there's been a little bit of an uptick in that since COVID, just because kids have had less practice sort of entering and exiting new spaces. But it was funny, Ted, what you were saying. I was thinking what you were saying about sort of helping yourself as a parent get grounded. And one of the questions we had discussed as a panel as we were planning for this is sort of what goes through your head when a child's clinging to a parent like Velcro on those first days. And one of the first thoughts I had was just compassion for the parent, because it's so hard when your kid's having a hard time getting to school. It can be embarrassing. It can be frustrating. It can break your heart, but I think sometimes we don't name some of the other emotions enough. Like it can be infuriating and just overwhelming and all these things. And so one of the other things that I have seen already, and I always see, is that it's hard when kids are having a hard time, and it always gets better. It always gets better without a doubt. Sometimes it gets worse before it gets better, but in the long run, those kids always find their way into a place in school where they can be engaged. So I feel that optimism also as the year is starting.
I think you're also raising a good point, Hannah, about not judging how the school year is going to go based on the first month. That a lot, that it can start off rocky, but not to kind of judge it based on the first month. So, Dana or Susan?
Absolutely.
I'm just loving everything, Hannah, you just said, and I'm particularly glad. I mean, well, let me dial it back for a minute. This school year started off really well, honestly. And like you, Hannah, we saw a lot of joy, a lot of excitement, kids really psyched to be back in school. And the component I wanted to really touch on, and I'm so glad you brought it right up, the elephant in the room, COVID. Because even though we are in a much different space, thank goodness, I think we have to be really careful to remember that all of these children, whether they are 3 or 12, they had a lot less practice navigating some of these things we're going to be talking about than we all would have liked. So when I think about a 3-year-old, I'm thinking about their toddler years and were they socializing as much? Or if I'm thinking about a 12-year-old, well, I'm thinking about back when they were 9 and they really didn't get as much practice. So I just think it's important to not overemphasize it, but not forget that that is the backdrop when we're holding these children right now. So I'm just really appreciating that. And the whole put on your oxygen mask first, as hard as it can be. And I get how hard it is to carve out any time. But when we allow for that, I think our kids really benefit. And when I think about that question, Hannah, too, about what do you do when your kid is literally clinging to you, two key things come to mind. And one is to really find it, you got to dig deep sometimes, but to really reassure your child in that moment, right? They're looking to you. They're looking for your signals. They're looking to know if you think things are okay. They're going to pick up on your cues. So even though, your heart might be, breaking inside, it's really important to reassure your child and to let them know that you trust these grownups you're about to leave them with. And that's actually a huge gift. Obviously, this is more about really little people, but that we're really giving kids, modeling that, right, is a really important gift. They know that there are other adults in their life that you trust, that you rely on, that they can rely on, and to make that really clear to them. You're leaving them with great people. You can validate, it's hard. It feels new. It feels different, but that you really trust the situation. And the one other piece related to that is to not let the goodbye go on for too long, because again, they're going to get really mixed messages if you're unable to, create that space. So even though it feels very counterintuitive, I would really encourage folks to give a confident and concise goodbye. So that's a little bit in relation to that topic.
Susanna, do you have some thoughts? Initial thoughts?
Yeah, I will echo what everyone has said. And I was also thinking like back to the beginning of the school year, and it was really, really hot. And it was really, really uncomfortable for so many of the staff and the kiddos. And then I was thinking about how important it was. We were one of the districts that did not have half days. How important it was to already start having those conversations about like, yeah, sometimes we're uncomfortable and sometimes we're hot. And it's just kind of like when we have those feelings of anxiety and worry, like, yeah, this stinks and it is really hard and we're just going to do it. We have to. It's a have to. School's a have to. So even though the heat was really a burden for the beginning of the school year, it was a really kind of good lesson to the kids and of course to the teachers that like, yeah, sometimes things are hard and we still have to do it and we're going to put a smile on our face and it's going to be okay. So I think going back to when you see that kid that's like strapped onto a parent's leg or crying, just not wanting to go into school, doing that validation and like, yes, it is so hard and we know it's so hard and we know you can do it. And that quick goodbye is always helpful. One thing that we started in COVID is not having parents come into the building. It works so much better. The transitions are easier, they're quicker, and there's less tears. So I guess I will pass it on to you.
And just as kind of an additional note, a quick and efficient goodbye, but no sneaking out. That's an ixnay on that one. For all of the kind of issues of trust that are going to result in how that's going to really amplify anxiety in the kind of the future. So no sneaking out, but a quick and a kind of efficient kind of goodbye. So wonder if we could just each of these kind of settings has some kind of specific things that you guys do to kind of help with anxious kids. They're more kind of techniquey. And so, Dana, you've talked about children writing letters. I'd like, I wonder if you could talk about that. And Suzanne, I wonder if you could just talk about your dog. And Hannah, I don't know what it would be at the campus school, but I'm sure you have kind of, little ideas as well. So Dana, could you, just talk about some of the things you do at the
Yeah,
campus?
at the common school, when we receive kids who are feeling sad or anxious, we often encourage them to write a letter home. So, or to co-create a letter with a teacher, right? To help them put their feelings out on paper. And then you can also start to, sort of reframe their focus. So it will go from getting their feelings out to, ooh, do you know how to write your name? Oh, well, if you don't, maybe we could, you could draw a picture so they know it's from you. And then it becomes about the art or, the process. And then, of course, envelopes can be really cool, right? Like kids love envelopes at times. And, that whole process of mailing it to your cubby where your parents can get it. So you're doing two things there, right? You're validating their feelings, you're affirming their feelings by getting them down on paper, but then you're also, of course, starting to shift their focus. And that can also happen on the other end of things. So, if we're feeling anxious at home, you could write a letter to a teacher, you could write a letter to a friend, you could write a letter, to one of the school counselors. It can work both ways. And the other thing I often encourage families to do is to sort of pregame, if you will, or map out what to expect. And yet you're threading the needle here because you don't want to do it too far in advance, right? Because you don't want the kids to hold it way before, but maybe, a couple of days before school starts, you can map out exactly what's going to happen, or you can create a social story for your child. And I often recommend only putting one picture and a very short sentence. We don't want to overwhelm your child with all the information, but on Monday or tomorrow, we go to school and maybe there's a photo of a school, or you can draw it. It's really more about the process. And then the next page is, when you get there, you will see your teacher, and so on and so forth. I think and then we will pick you up X. So, you kind of take them through a very simple version of the morning. So again, that mapping can be really reassuring to children, I have found. Susanna.
I like, Dana, how you kind of describe it, because I think when it comes to writing stories, I think people often get a little daunted by that. And the idea of keeping it very simple to one sentence and not, and more of a mapping, I think is really kind of very helpful, because it's such a useful technique to provide children kind of with a little book like that. And it's different, I think, from reading a book, because it comes from a parent. And there are plenty of, books like The Kissing Hand and stuff like that that are great books. But I think that the books that parents write for their children have an immediacy that these other books do not have. So I'm sorry, Suzanne, go ahead. Yeah, I think.
Great. So I can speak a little bit about kind of things that we do at the public school where I work. So we do have a therapy dog, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with the research that therapy dogs can really help regulate kids and such. I'm just thinking to the first day of school this year, there was a first grader, very tearful, and the principal brought the first grader over and said, "Hey, do you want to pet the dog?" And she just looked at this big fluffy dog and just started petting, and the tears just dried up. And then all of a sudden, she was talking about her dog. And then it was like, okay, let's get her going on the routine of the morning, because that's always our goal, is to, once the goodbye happens, to get the kids going in the structure and routine, and ideally doing what all the other kids are doing. Something else, because we're a neighborhood school, if a kiddo runs anxious, if mornings are hard, I always try to see if the family can either bike to school, walk the dog to school, scooter to school, anything active, just to get all of those feelings of worry out of your system. So that's really has been helpful. Also, sometimes like the little transitional objects doesn't work for everyone, but I saw a bunch of kindergartners this past week. They had little pictures of their family, or like a little bracelet that they, something special between the caregiver and the student that they could kind of just touch throughout the day. Again, not everything works for everybody, but those little small transitional objects can be helpful, or even a stuffed animal. I would encourage families to reach out to the teacher before they come up with their own plans. Like, I know a couple families have sent like Apple Watches so the kiddo can like communicate with the family throughout the day. So again, encouraging families to reach out to the school before they set something in place. And just building upon the child's strengths. There was one kiddo that was really anxious, but dancing helps. So we would have like a little dance party every morning to get the body moving, things like that.
But you are making a very good, important point that anxiety is ultimately about movement. It's fight, flight, or freeze. And children typically have all of this anxious energy and no place to go with it. And so what you're pointing out is that if we can give them any kind of outlet to kind of discharge that, and that will do wonders for kind of anxiety, because otherwise they have all of this energy and no place to go with it, and so out comes panic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's nice to go last because I'm just nodding my head with so many of the things that you've said. And I think just the themes of them are so important, like engagement. And Dana, you mentioned that from the get-go, or with a therapy dog, like the moment you can get a child engaged with something outside of the worry. And I think, I've heard this in your language, but I just want to highlight also, I think it's about acknowledging that the worries are there, but that is not the point of engagement. It's sort of like, oh yeah, worries are here. That's how it goes sometimes when you're coming into school. Let's, you, me, and the worries, let's all go, do this, which sometimes takes some time. It's not an instantaneous hit, but I think it's something that educators and helpers often have in mind, that we can kind of put our arm around those worries and bring them with us, but that's not the place that we're going to start the interaction or the negotiation. So that engagement piece, the rituals and practicing of goodbyes with an object sometimes that goes, the bracelet or the scarf or something that transfers from parent to child. The story is awesome. And I was also just thinking about sort of, Dana, I think you mentioned this too, like sometimes we do feel the worries, kids often have worries about their physical ailments, for example, and we might say, let's just, I'll start a list right here and I can mark this down. I'll make sure your parents get that at the end of the day or something. So there's a way to acknowledge and again, to hold, not to deny it, but also not to make it the center point or the thing that causes action to happen. And I think that's a balance I'm guessing we all try and hit, is sort of that piece of compassion and also, and let's get engaged over here.
Yeah, I think, one might say that empathy is the secret sauce for dealing with stress. And if your child doesn't feel that you kind of get it or kind of connect with them, you're not going to get too much cooperation. And, children want to feel that they are not alone with their feelings, as we all do. And at the same time, with anxiety, we need to help children get out of their heads and focus more onto the external world, which is in part what kind of grounding activities are about. And actually, if you think about it, the classic book, Goodnight Moon, is about a book about grounding. A little anxious bunny rabbit is sitting there in bed. And what are they doing? Good night, room. Good night to the old lady whispering hush, good night to the picture of the cow jumping over. It is for the bunny rabbits, anxious moments at night, focusing on the sense data coming from her exteroceptive senses rather than kind of from coming in inside. So.
And I think that piece around empathy is so, so important. And I think it's one of the most complicated ones as a parent to figure out, because empathy in its nuance is, I think, often different than soothing or problem solving. And to sometimes it's like we're holding two things, both the empathy and the normalizing, or like, yeah, starting school does bring worries. I bet you're feeling worried, that we're both empathizing, but not necessarily joining into the worry or feeling that we need to solve the worry. And I would say that's one of the places I see, both for myself as a parent and all the parents that I get to observe, that's kind of a snarly place to sort out. And it's often a place where some language or some modeling from helpers can be really helpful, because when we're flooded with all our parent hormones and thoughts that tell us to solve and protect, we do tend to go towards soothing or problem solving rather than just empathizing and staying put in the hard situation.
Well, providing comfort as parents is what we do best. And it feels great to provide comfort. But unfortunately, in the kind of land of anxiety, unfortunately, it doesn't work. And, certainly with regard to school, I think it's important for us not to look to our child to validate our decisions about kind of school. That, I know going to school is hard, it's scary, and you're going to school. I hear you, I believe you, and we have to go to school.
Ted, can I just
Yes.
just on a personal note, because I know we've done some talking about things that might seemingly pertain to little kids, but for caregivers who are on the call with bigger kids, I just wanted to share a personal anecdote that I had a child who she refused to go into high school, and she was so anxious and so overwhelmed. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm really not going to be able to get my kid to school. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I had to really steel myself and remember that I am not being unkind or insensitive or remiss by saying exactly what you just said, which was, this is all true. And I'm sorry, I can't remember, it was Hannah or Susanna who said, and I know you can do this. I know you can do this, even though it's hard. And what I did was I alerted her school counselor and the nurse, and I said, we're coming. And I had to ultimately turn my daughter over to the professionals in the school, which felt like a huge leap of faith. And it worked. It was imperfect, and it worked. And she was able to trust the professionals in her school. She built a really important relationship with both those people, and in time it worked. So I just wanted to really emphasize how much I appreciate that. And this obviously pertains to our big kids as well.
I'd like to follow up on that question and then come back to the question of, more practically, just what do, if any of the parents here have a child holding onto them like Velcro, what's the thing to do? But before we get to that question, I'd like to follow up, Dan, on what you were saying is helping children kind of go to school involves a kind of a collaboration between kind of parent and kind of child. And I'd like your thoughts about how can we kind of foster that kind of working kind of collaboration? Because, at its worst, you have a child who has trouble getting to school, and then at some point the school feels that they have to file a 51A or something for neglect. And I typically don't find that being too helpful. So I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are about how we can kind of foster kind of a working relationship, both ways.
I
mean,
really, yeah, I'm curious, and particularly for folks, who are clinicians in schools. I do think, though, that a couple of key things. I mean, the very first thing is just to remember, as hard as even though it may not feel this way, that the folks working in schools, we're really on your team. We really are. We're really on your side. Like, trust me when I say that no one would work in a school setting if they didn't care deeply about the well-being of children. That's sort of just at a baseline. And so it's all about sort of teaming up and confiding your own vulnerabilities, right? And asking for assistance, because it makes our job so much easier when we understand where the challenges are, where the vulnerabilities are, and that ultimately we are on the same page. I understand there may be different perspectives on how to go about these things. But I hope that folks can come forward with the notion that we really are trying to do best by your child, and that we do have a lot of experience, right, working with a really wide range of kids. Again, even though sometimes it's like, you don't know my kid, and you know what? That's true. Nobody knows a child better than their parents. And being in a school setting, a group setting, is very different than being at home with your child alone or with their siblings. It's just apples and oranges in terms of how that child is or can be, right? Or how they might interact with school professionals. So I would really just encourage candor, reaching out for help. I need help. And then making a plan. Make a plan with, Hannah or Susanna or whoever it might be who's assisting you. And then sticking to that plan, I think, can be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Dana, that is so well said. And I think, as I said in the beginning, I think so often when our kids are having trouble, we can feel embarrassed or ashamed, for ourselves, for our child, or feel bad about the imposition of it. And I think that what you said is so true. Like, this is the work of school. One of the things the panel was talking about, right before everybody came in, was how much starting school is a great metaphor for so many of the things that we have to do as children and as adults, transition, new routine, the unknown and the unexpected. We sort of never stop having to find those places. And so as teachers in schools, we're so invested in helping kids find their way with that. I think it's especially important too, because a very close friend to anxiety, I think, can be anger. In other words, when kids who are feeling super anxious have to do something, sometimes they get very angry about it. And any parent who's tried to bring a kid to swim lessons, for example, and the kid has not wanted to go to swim lessons, knows that kids can get really mad at you as a parent. And I think that can be true with schools also. So kids may say, oh, my teacher is, XYZ. Or as a parent who's feeling very anxious, those feelings can come up with a school too. And so the more that there's communication, the more that there's collaboration, the more you can keep track of that and have it be really constructive and not sort of break down into a feeling of tug of war or lack of safety, or feeling that they don't get me and I don't get them.
I don't have much to add to that because you both said it so well. Again, just repeating what you said, assuming the positive intent and reaching out early. So as soon as your kiddo starts to say, I don't want to go to school, and reach out to the teacher, the counselors, whoever it may be, and we will come up with a plan, because like so many of you know, there's a lot of anxiety. A lot of kids have anxiety. So we're well equipped to manage and collaborate and work together.
We need that communication because, if there's image we want to keep in mind with regard to children, it's the image of an iceberg. And above the waterline is the school refusal or being a pain in the butt or just the, whatever. And what we always need to be asking ourselves is, okay, what's below the waterline? What's generating this? What this is all about? And we need that especially with children because they're actually they require a little decoding. They're particularly the younger you are, they require more decoding in terms of what's this about. And I think that we all can kind of benefit from other people's observations and thoughts about what's underneath the waterline. And it's certainly important for teachers to be aware of that from what the parent has to offer. But it's also important for the parent to have a relationship with the school where they can kind of trust that that initial response the child has to separation isn't the final word or statement about how the day is going to go. And to feel that there is kind of an active communication, kind of to show that. Now, it's also important at the school's end not to give a kind of a brush off and say, oh, they're fine. I mean, it's, to my mind, it's a little bit like if you have a babysitter and you're driving them home and they say, oh, Joey was great. You have no idea if that's all the babysitter says, whether Joey just participated in satanic ritualistic abuse of some sort, or whether they actually had a good time. But when you can get some more specifics, like, yep, Joey, it was hard the first, 10 to 15 minutes, and then he got interested in what Samantha was doing, and it was pretty good, except he was a little wobbly around, nap time, something like that. That gives you a better sense and kind of confidence. And, that's what I would hope, if possible, we have at both ends.
Absolutely. And those, it just keeps circling back too, I think, because when you, as a parent, when you get an email like that or a call or something, not only can you settle down and get on with your day, but at the end of the day, then you have a chance. I think all parents want to know how the day went. And so the tendency can be sort of like to ask, did you start feeling comfortable, or did you get into the room, or whatever it is. But it often is much more useful to ask about the science project or the math project or who you hung out with. And when teachers can give some of that information, parents are much more able to engage in sort of a proactive conversation that doesn't lead right back to the anxiety, but is about that engagement, or about the successes, or about the challenges, or the funny things, or the people, or anything other than the worry and the fact that they made it in, which of course is front and center for all parents.
So, okay, so I like your thoughts about it's possible there may be a parent here who's got a child holding on like Velcro to their, and it's not easy. So when you encounter that kind of situation, what are some of the thoughts that kind of go through your mind in terms of how we can kind of, help move things forward?
I can start. I think someone shared this right in the beginning, but like the first thought is empathy. I have so much empathy for that parent because typically they're on their way to work or they're doing something. And we've probably all been there as parents. I know I definitely have. The next thing that comes to my mind is I want to reach out to this parent later in the day when we can really strategize in case this happens again. Sometimes it only happens once and then we're good to go for the rest of the school year. But strategizing in front of the kiddo isn't very useful, and it doesn't normally work. So then I'm going to like look at that parent and give them a big smile and just say, I know this is going to be the hardest minute right now. And I want you to give a big hug and say goodbye. And ideally, that's when I can distract the kiddo with the dog or anything that I have on me and get them into the routines. Sometimes I think someone already shared this, but like externalize that worry. It looks like worry's here today. That can be so hard. Again, back to the empathy, and let's try to get into the routines. I'm trying to think what else. Oftentimes I will do that crosstalk. Again, if it doesn't work that first time, like give a big hug and walk away, I'll say, I know it's so hard to say goodbye, but as soon as you're out of sight, it's easier for the kiddo to move on. So just little tips like that with the crosstalk sometimes help. And sometimes it doesn't work. And then I have the parent come into my office or what have you to help with that transition. But
I just wanted to take that just one tiny step further, Susanna. I sometimes say, give the kind of hug that will last all day. Give the kind of hug that will last all day, because, it is hard. It really is. And then, of course, I don't have all the books off the top of my head, but there's so many lovely books that depict this process, right? I don't even know if it's still considered one of the new, but there was the kissing hand and, these little rituals that you can do with your child. And so it's a moment where you can kind of combine things that, like Suzanne has said, and Hannah has said, in terms of like, what's the ritual? Is it putting a tiny heart rock in a child's hand, closing it, saying, put that in your pocket. We're going to have a hug that lasts all day. You've got your rock with you. And then again, that succinct, the clarity, I think, on the part of the parent is huge. And again, I want to emphasize, I know it's counterintuitive. It is to everyone. And yet it's really important.
I think just to kind of, add to that, in those moments, we really want to kind of infuse our children with our warmth. And I want to give you a hug that's going to last all day, hug, hug, hug. Oh, no. I think we just got to 1:45. I need to fill you up just a little bit more. I need another 45-minute kind of, fill that hug, something like that. That's a little kind of, playful like that. I think, can be helpful.
I was thinking about the language people used earlier. I think, Ted, you said this, or maybe came in my mind. It can sometimes, as a parent, feel like a game of chicken, because children and their worries are bloodhounds for doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if they sense hesitation or doubt, they are going to go after it, So sometimes on the first day, everybody's just shooting in the dark to try and figure out what's going to make it happen. And you do leave a crying child, or, but to Susanna's point, I think then sometimes it's the conversation later in the day that plans for the next day where you really can gain some traction. And I think that piece around the warmth, and Susanna used the word earlier, which I use a lot too. It's a have to. School's a have to. And to take it out of the choice or the sort of that the parent, this is a have to for everybody. It's a have to for the teachers. It's a have to for parents. It's a have to for kids, And so again, as a parent, you've got those two channels running as like, this is a have to, and I love you. I know it's hard, and then having that definitive goodbye, because when it wobbles, kids will always go for the wobble. In my experience, an anxious kid who doesn't want to go to school will always, if there's an opening, they will take it. And that's why I call it a game of chicken, because of course, as parents, we can be dying on the inside, and every bone in our body can want to say, okay, let's leave this scenario, because everybody will feel better. But you kind of have to fake the funk until, you feel more confident.
Yeah, it's a little Botox parenting, and and having a little mantra to yourself, that I can do this. My child can do this. They can do this. This is hard, but we can do it.
Ed, someone once said to me, parenting is theater. It's all theater. and obviously it's not all theater, but I understood what she was saying, which is that Botox parenting, I'm going to use that one, but sometimes we got to put on an act in order to reassure our children that we know they're safe, we know they're cared for, we know they're with trusted adults.
Yeah, they really do have incredible radar for picking up our anxiety. It just just in our physical kind of demeanor. There was a study done by an infant psychologist, Ed Tronick, in which he had 8-month-old babies and their moms, and in one condition, he had the moms before playing with their babies, listening. The babies were in a little car seat, listening to just normal baby gurgling, and with headphones like this. And in the other condition, they were listening to very aversive baby crying. And they took off the headphones and were just playing with their infants, but the moms who had just been listening to the aversive crying, those infants got more upset and more distraught, even though the moms, as far as they could say, looking at their interaction second by second through a videotape, could not detect any differences. It was that subtle. So
and it's interesting because I think for people who have older kids, and I'm thinking like college students or something like that, I do think, you're channeling that confidence, and where you can, I think it's also okay to name, but I think that works better for older kids. Like, I don't think I'd necessarily do that with a kindergartner, but with a college student, you can certainly name it too. Like, yeah, I'm nervous. You're going away for the first time.
Mhm.
I know you've got this, but my heart's fluttering too. That there can be a normalizing there. And I think that's important to say, because that it's at this balance between naming, and that you can name worry and still be very confident in the action that's being taken.
Mhm. Absolutely. Let's see. I'm wondering whether there are any questions from the audience that we could kind of direct the conversation to. And if they're not, we can kind of continue. But I wonder if there are any kind of questions that have kind of come up in the chat, or if people would like to kind of pose them.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet,
Okay.
but
Well,
feel free
well,
to ask them if anyone has them. I did actually have a question back to, I think, Susanna's comment about making sure the transitional object is something that you communicate with the school with or about. And you mentioned that, we don't want to be using something like an Apple Watch that they can like text or call their parent, for example. Could you explain kind of maybe more like the appropriate transitional items that maybe you've seen, and why maybe an Apple Watch or something to that effect would not be as useful?
Sure. So I think the ones that have been the most helpful are the little pictures, the little like comments in the lunch boxes, like you got this, or some positive, little positive note. I think little stuffed animals can be helpful as long as it's, okay with the teachers, because there's a lot of rules that teachers have, and sometimes it's no toys from home. But again, like, teachers are really willing to work with the family. So if they say, hey, this little stuffed animal is going to make my kids stay a lot better, the teacher, I'm sure, will say, absolutely, put it in the backpack. We'll put the stuffed animal to bed if necessary in the cubby for the day. Any little fidgets, like a little worry stone, has sometimes been helpful. Anything like textures, I'm thinking like something soft, something like a little piece of, art project that they did with like a little Velcro, so the kid can rub on the Velcro. Apple Watches and communicating throughout the day, we have found that it's not so helpful because then, one, it can be really disruptive. Two, it adds another transition. So if they're talking to the parent at school, then it really often will remind the kid like, oh my gosh, I want to be home. I want to be with that parent right now. And then we have to deal with, not deal, but like manage another like escalation, if that makes sense, from the kid. I'm not being very articulate there, but.
No, I think you're bringing up kind of an important point about the counterintuitive nature of reassurance seeking, and kind of Apple Watches provide the opportunity for texting and phoning the parent through the day. And, what's been found kind of consistently with regard to that is it provides kind of short-term relief, but it actually makes the anxiety kind of worse. That kind of, reassurance seeking, in a way, it has that you have a basis for being worried that you can't handle the day or that school is dangerous. And it's good to kind of check in. And the reassurance seeking consistently, provides a short-term thing, but it undoubtedly actually feeds the anxiety and kind of, it makes it kind of worse. One of the kind of trickier, more nuanced aspects of this comes up with children who are afraid of throwing up. And their numerous visits to the school nurse, potentially. And the communication between parent and school is really important there, so that we can have a way of talking about, is this being sick, or is this being kind of worried sick? Because if we don't make that kind of distinction, then essentially this child's going to be coming home, all the time because they're complaining that their tummy hurts. And we certainly want to kind of be alert to that's the stomach flu, but we're also, I think, doing a disservice if we don't also look at the kind of the issue of that it may be a worried stomach. And I think that's kind of an important area for kind of parent, school communication with a school nurse in that kind of situation.
Thank you. There's a couple of other questions that people have put in the chat. The first one is, you've talked a lot about handling the transfer to school once they've arrived, but what if the child is getting anxious every night before the school day? The worries interfere with bedtime and more refusals in the morning, causing stress about making it to school on time. My child is 12 and starting middle school, but this behavior has happened at previous schools as well.
It's a great question. And one we were thinking about too, because that's really, it's not always the separation. It can be that perseverating worry that's at home. I had two thoughts about that question that I would be willing to share, but there are no way the total answer to them at all. But one thing that I think anxiety really likes to seek is problem solving. So parents and kids often get into cycles where kids are raising worries and parents are trying to solve them with the thought that if we could solve some of these worries, then there wouldn't be any more worry. Even when you've decided you're not going to solve it, just the persistent worry, as this parent talked about, can get in the way of bed or something like that. So there's two things that I think about with that. One is that starting with the empathy, like I really hear that worry. Kids don't always need a solution to it. Sometimes they just need an acknowledgement of it, and doing some acknowledging, and that can just be a straight reflection. You're really worried about X, is one step in that direction. Another, especially as you go to older kids, but I really think this is true across the age span, is to look to kids as problem solvers. So an example of this would be a kid who is worried, like they're not going to, what if I lose my water bottle? A problem solving parent will say, let's get you 2 water bottles. And we'll pack 2 water bottles. But the problem is then the worry will just say, what if I lose that water bottle? And you'll be in the cycle. If you want a child to be a problem solver, you might say, yeah, what would you do if that water bottle, what could you do if that water bottle disappeared? And start to help kids see themselves as problem solvers in that moment. That's one idea. When you need to disengage, though, I think it's also sometimes at bedtime, it's time to put a stop to it. And one of my favorite therapists and colleagues, Lisa Barendez, she used to talk about this with complaints. And anxious kids oftentimes really complain a lot, but sometimes they also worry a lot. So you could use this as complaint or worry. But Lisa used to always say, the complaint counter is open. You can complain as much as you want for 5 minutes, and then the complaint counter is going to close. And sometimes that's good when you're having conflict with a kid as a parent, but sometimes I use that with worries too. Like, you can name some worries for about 5 minutes, but now worry time is over, and that has to wait till the morning. And sometimes kids will respond to that boundary setting. None of these things work 100% of the time, but sometimes it needs to be like, it's time to do something else. And they may need help doing something else and helping them get engaged, or they may just need you to leave. If you're talking about a 12 or 13-year-old and it's happening at bedtime, it's kind of like maybe you're leaving the room and just saying, I'll be here to talk about these things in the morning, but for right now it's lights out and I'm disengaging from this conversation.
I think those are great ideas. I mean, nighttime is certainly a favorite time for worries to come out, and just to kind of, label that, well, of course you've got worries. It's bedtime and you don't have any kind of distraction. No kidding. And then, I know it really sucks to have these thoughts at night, doesn't it? For younger kids, one of my favorite things to do is to have them make a worry motel, and to have a box that, I've got it right here. I've got my worry motel. Got my worry motel. Okay. And you would write down or draw your worries and put them into the motel. And we know that worries don't cooperate. So we need to have some of your action figures or stuffed animals or stuffies guarding the motel and telling those worries when they try to sneak out to get back in the motel. That writing down of kind of worries can be kind of helpful. And recognizing that there's no presto changeo magic here. It takes kind of practice to do that. If they're willing to do that, is to let's draw those worries and maybe give them a makeover. Maybe turn them into something kind of silly. If they've read Harry Potter, let's do a little Defense Against the Dark Arts. Treat them as boggarts, those shape changers that take on the form of your worst worries, and use the Ridiculum curse and turn them into something silly. But at a base, I think certainly just acknowledging their worries, and so that they don't feel alone, I think is, essential.
I've even gone as far, Hannah, I just wanted to say, I love that you're putting the time, the parameters, right, around this. And of course, the worry motel, really clear parameter, which I totally used with my kid very successfully for a long time. But I've even gone as far, and I don't know, Ted, if you found this, if you would agree with this, but Freya, when my kid got older and was anticipating the worries, I would definitely create the structure Hannah described, and I would even take it a step further, because sometimes the perseveration was so extreme, and I would say, I'm actually in charge now. I'm actually going to be in charge now. This is too much, so this is what we're doing. And I would, actually help her turn her attention elsewhere. Like, I'd give her the window that Hannah and Ted have described, and then I'd say, okay, we're done. I'm in charge. We're not doing this anymore. this is what we're going to do. And maybe it was, even for a big kid, I'm going to read aloud to you, or, you know, a bigger kid, maybe we're going to watch an episode of Friends together before we go to sleep, or whatever it might be. But to really just assert that I wasn't going to let the perseveration continue. And that always felt a little risky, I'll be honest, personally, but it felt, it actually worked really well.
I'm gonna move on to, oh wait, sorry, Ted, did you have one more thing?
In keeping with what Dan just said, you know, feeling risky, we have to give ourselves permission in helping our anxious children to be kind of imperfect, because, you know, we are always facing the challenge as parents of how much to push and how much to kind of protect. And it's not always easy reading somebody's nervous system in terms of knowing how much they're really up for or not. And we're not always going to kind of get it right. Sometimes we're going to, you know, push too much, not push enough. And I think that one of our greatest strengths as parents is our capacity to kind of observe what's going on and then kind of make adjustments from there. But we have to give ourselves permission to kind of, you know, be imperfect, and we're not always going to kind of get it right in terms of pushing too much or not, you know, pushing enough. So
I think that's such an important reminder. And I think, you know, all of these things that we're suggesting run the danger of sort of feeling like, well, I tried that and it didn't work. But if there's nuggets that you hear in what we're saying, like, oh, wait, that is a place that I could do, it's just trying and trying again, you know, so taking one little nugget and giving it a shot. And sometimes it works and that feels great. And sometimes it fails miserably. But either way, you and your child survive that and you've learned something, and then you can pick up another nugget in some way. I did want to say also, I know there was a second part of the question, which was about when those worries show up in the morning. And that is also really tricky, right? And that's often precurses the child who can't separate. Sometimes the separation worry, or just the worries in general, start to tank the ship at home before you even get to school. And there's been a lot of things mentioned already that sometimes help, like having movement on the way to school, or having movement in the morning so that that body moves in the face of the worry. So it doesn't have to be that you walk to school. Maybe it's that trampolining becomes part of the morning routine, or going for a walk or a run. Sometimes parents have a stop that they make before they get to school, you know, like, well, we're not, you know, we're going to have our hot chocolate and then we're on our way to school. And for, you know, a 12-year-old, often there can be some collaboration around what a good morning looks like, and sort of co-creating that morning, and then setting a period of time that you're going to stick to what you've come up with, and then you'll reconvene and re-edit as necessary. So I do think that you can do some thinking, some creative thinking about that. What are some things that we've noticed that have helped? What are some things that make it harder? I have a few suggestions. You have a few suggestions. Let's choose one of each. Try it for 2 days. And how are we going to know if it's working? In the case of this parent, it sounds like it might be getting to school on time. If it doesn't work, then let's reconvene and try something else. If it does work, let's do more of that. So sometimes that collaborative problem solving can really help. And just knowing, again, that just like when you tried to put an infant to sleep, nothing works forever. And you have to weather it when it doesn't work anymore, and then reconvene and figure out, okay, what's the next way I'm going to do this? And know that, you know, we all have to stay flexible in that way.
Thank you. I think this is a good transition to the second question. This person says they have a 6th grader who also struggles when they get home. They seem very tired and grumpy, and they want to decompress with a screen. I don't want that to be the only way or main way that the child decompresses. Do you have any other tips for other ways?
I think kind of echoing what Hannah was saying, doing that collaborative problem solving approach, because it is a 6th grader, they could have some insight, and you could be like, So I'm noticing that you are going on your screens every day after school. Do you think you could do a little something else first? What do you think we could do so that's not an everyday thing? I also don't think it's the worst thing in the world. And maybe this is an unpopular belief, but I think if a kiddo wants, they might be holding it together all day at school. School's a lot of work. And maybe that is how your kiddo decompresses, by going on screens for an hour and setting that time limit, knowing that after screens, then they have to choose something else. So I think that collaborative problem solving with your kid and just trying to figure out a balance, because I do know, having a screen obsessed child myself, like I get, like they do get a lot out of it with the social aspect and the kind of downtime. So it's tricky. I get it.
Also with your question, it would also make me kind of curious to know a little bit more about your child in terms of what parts of school may be particularly exhausting for him. Is it particular kind of academic part? Is it particular kind of social kind of stuff? And I would also kind of wonder about just his or her kind of sensory kind of makeup, in which are there things that he just gets overstimulated at school and really kind of needs that kind of downtime, and whether there are some other hints about things that can kind of help him kind of recover. But so it's the kind of question where I'd like to know a little bit more about how your particular kind of child kind of works to because that's a sort of a tip of the iceberg kind of thing. Above the waterline, we see a lot of screen time. What we don't know is what's the source of kind of exhaustion about that, or whatever it might be below the waterline.
I don't have specific ones to recommend, but I know other parents of that age child who turn to podcasts. Like apparently there's some very cool podcasts for kids that age that are very intriguing. So I don't know if, your child might be interested. There's something about, right, zoning out a little bit, putting on your headphones, lying down, maybe finding a podcast that is really juicy and relevant. Maybe even one about gaming. Who knows?
I think that context matters a lot, because I think if it's one of many tools, but we also do know, and I really agree with what Susanna said, sometimes kids are just exhausted at the end of the day, and that is a very soothing space for them, and they can come out of it kind of in a better place. That being said, we also know that phones can sort of cause that very compelling cycle where they phones or gaming or computers, whatever, they soothe us, and then we're sort of not flexing a muscle we need to flex. So sometimes there's, it's helpful always, I think, to have broader conversations in families about sort of, knowing what our state is when we're going off onto something and off of something, and being able to problem solve around that. So on the other end of things, kids often have a lot of hard time coming off tech, right? But if they can begin to recognize that, and they have a bag of tools they can use when they're coming off, that's helpful. I also think sometimes a slight delay breaks some of that cycle that can happen, that can be very addictive. So, for a child who, this is a metaphor, but hopefully the parallel works. Like for a child who's wanting to go to the nurse all the time, we often will just delay them a little bit, because it's the instant gratification that's very reinforcing. But if you can delay a little bit, it's a little less reinforcing, but it's still meeting the need. And so, sometimes with kids, and sometimes it's worth the battle, sometimes it's not, but there can be a little like, let's do something for 10 minutes when we get home. And this might be part of the collaborative problem solving that Susanna was talking to too. Like, you want to get on your screen. I want to make sure you have some decompression time before you get on your screen. So, what can we come up with? And maybe it's that you do something for 10 minutes before you get on your screen. You have a snack, or you walk around the block with me, or you do something with the dog for a few minutes before you get on that. Because if it's feeling like that instant, like I have to have this or I can't function, that's when you want to space it out a little bit. If it's just kind of like, this is my preferred activity and this soothes me, and then we move on, that's a little bit of a different place. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there is a difference there.
What you're pointing out is anxiety, exhaustion, intense feelings are first responders. And if we can kind of make them wait, we have a chance for some other possibilities to emerge. And certainly with anxiety, it's a first responder. And if we can kind of make them wait, as in going to the school nurse, then we have a chance for their body to naturally just kind of calm down on its own. And we know with panic reactions that they typically take, as long as you're not adding to the excitement by saying, I can't handle this, I'm going to die, they typically resolve themselves within 15 minutes. As long as you're not adding to the excitement. So if you can kind of delay things, sometimes you have a chance for the first responders to get bored and other things to happen.
Thank you. And then the last question here is, excuse me, I know this is somewhat specific situation, but my child has disabilities, visually impaired, nonverbal, motor delays, cerebral palsy that contribute to his fears in new situations. In some ways, I have been his eyes, his voice since birth. Any advice specific to a child whose separation anxiety has at least partially been a very practical basis? How to manage the separation, since I have already started the year being in the preschool classroom with him to facilitate training with staff given his safety needs.
All right, give me a second here.
The words that come to mind for me are slow and steady. If you're starting in that classroom, there's going to be a gradual release from you to the other caretakers. And in that, there's going to be a learning that there can be other helpers in the room. And I think going back to some of the suggestions that Dana and Susanna and Ted have made, there's ways that you can, depending on how your child most likes to communicate. So I don't know what's possible, but oftentimes I look for ways to reinforce that narrative with a story, with a book, with pictures. Sometimes we might review with kids, let's think of all the people in the building who can help with this, or all the people in the classroom who can help with this. And maybe it's pictures of faces, maybe it's names. But the experience of gradually moving from your care into somebody else's, if you can really scaffold that slowly, where you're gradually stepping back more and more, the learning is experiential. And that is the best kind of learning.
I totally echo you, Hannah, in terms of I was going to say like scaffolded extraction, where obviously you are there. It's so important that you're there. Again, you know your child better than anyone. And I really appreciate what you just said, Hannah, about that slow and steady transition as your child becomes more comfortable with these other caregivers.
There's really such an important learning process and learning for other people to learn how to read your child's signals. And you've had plenty of practice doing that. I mean, you're kind of a real expert at that. And other people can learn that, but they certainly need time to learn the subtle kind of nuances about how your child may communicate, this is too much. And when all of the nonverbal ways in which he or she may be communicating that. And and I think that's certainly part of the kind of the task, is learning that so that we can really help this child kind of feel safe and kind of competent in school. And I think that, it's important because in general, as a society, we tend to underestimate or minimize the feelings of small children. And I don't think we always give them the attention and respect that they need. And, so I would certainly agree with, Dana and Hannah, and just, add the importance of really people spending some time to learn how to kind of help decode your child.
And I can only imagine in your situation that, like, I would have a lot of anxiety kind of passing over my kiddo that I've been doing so much for. And then once you're feeling comfortable with the staff and safer with the staff, then your child will feel that. And then you'll be able to empower the school and the teachers and just reiterate, like, you will be safe and sound there. They are so good at what they do. And be able to have that transition go smoothly.
Yeah, I'd certainly want to have a sense of whoever was taking care of that they get who your child is and how they communicate, and not and really kind of feel that kind of in your gut, not just, somebody saying, oh yeah, I've dealt with a million kids like this before, and stuff like that, but more, visceral sense that they get your little pumpkin.
I think with all of these things we're talking about, all of it's easier said than done. And sometimes the doing of it takes more time than anybody would like it to take. And I think as people who've seen it happen again and again, it can be sometimes easier or more automatic for us to keep the faith in that. But, one thing that I think can sometimes be interesting to do is to write down sort of what your goals are, or where you're trying to get, or even where you're at. Because as you move through a process, it's easy to lose track of the progress you're making, because in any given moment, the problem at hand is the problem at hand. But, maybe you start off the year and you have to be in the classroom with your child, but then maybe a month later you're in the library, and maybe a month after that you're in your car, and then, who's to say how long it takes? I think that's part of the work of parents and schools, is to find the pacing that works for everybody involved. And sometimes it does take a long time, but keep track of the progress you're making, because it's easy to forget you're making progress when it is small and incremental. But if you keep track of it, often you'll be surprised to be like, oh yeah, we are in a different place than we were in 3 weeks ago. We are in a different place. It might still be challenging, but it's different than it was 3 weeks ago, and it will be different again 3 weeks from now. I was just thinking about the patience piece.
So I think we have 2 more. We're almost out of time. It's almost 5:30, but we'll see how far we can get. What is the difference in roles between the adjustment counselor and a guidance counselor in terms of who communicates with parents or around 504s, for example? And how does one get help when you move into a new school like JFK or Northampton High School?
I can speak a little to that. It sounds like you're wondering who's in charge of the 504s. At JFK, they have a 504 coordinator. I cannot think of the name right now. But if your child is on a 504, typically at JFK, they would see the guidance counselor. So you can reach out to the counseling center there and ask for the guidance counselor who's working with, does it have a grade in here? No. So the adjustment counselors typically at JFK and the high school work with the students that are solely that have the IEPs, and it's the guidance counselors that are working with the general ed population and the students on 504s. I hope that explained it. If not, feel free to write another question. And they should be setting up meetings annually for the 504s.
Our next question, how do you parse school avoidance due to anxiety versus avoidance based on parts of school that aren't working for your child? My child sometimes has separation anxiety and school-based anxiety, but other times she doesn't seem anxious at all, but still will not go. I model my commitment to and confidence in the school, but I privately have doubts about certain aspects of the school. One of my daughter's complaints is that the school day is too long. We say that school is a have to for both students and teachers, but it's really not. Teachers have chosen to be there and can quit. I know when a child is being told that I had no choice about whether or not I go to school, worked for a while, but eventually led me to be very upset at school. Sometimes it feels like empathizing, but holding a hard line is not allowing for the very real possibility that there are parts of school that are not right for my child. I also know that making it a daily choice is a trap for an anxious child.
I think this question in many ways goes back to some of the collaboration we talked about between parents and schools. Ideally, and I know this does not always happen, this is the sort of question that a team within a school can hold, where parents and teachers can hold this together, not with the notion of blame, but with the notion of let's really bring our two knowings of this child together and understand which of this is anxiety and which of this is really not fit. And certainly there's always times where maybe a cohort has a certain dynamic to it, or a school has a certain pace to it. You know, all those things vary. And there's no question that there are times that kids are in a better or worse fit. Again, in a perfect world, I think this is something that you can be in conversation with the trusted people at a school about. And then as a parent, you know, you have to do that soul searching and knowing of your child too, right? There's something that I know that does not feel right. But that's not a perfect distinction. And kids can also be pretty convincing when they're feeling anxious. So I think you're right to be very cautious, because I do think an anxious child can convince people very quickly and deeply that there's something wrong. But then it will replicate itself in a new setting because it's really about the worry and not about the place.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a situation that really cries for a very careful kind of collaboration between you and the kind of school system. And I would hope that the school is willing to kind of embrace you kind of in trying to kind of figure this situation out. Because it's, there, there's the issue of how much do we push, how much do we kind of protect, and finding the kind of the right balance with that. And it's complicated. Your situation's complicated, it sounds like to me. We kind of really need kind of a thoughtful kind of collaboration, this one apart. So sorry, we don't have more magic bullets for that one. So
there's no other questions at this time, but I was wondering if we could maybe talk about some book recommendations. That was one of the questions that we were thinking of answering. Favorite books or for kids, but also parents. we can end with that.
Sure. For anxiety, the standouts are books by Dawn Hubner, What to Do When You Worry Too Much, What to Do When Your Brain Gets Stuck, What to Do When You Dread Your bed, and her book for middle school kids. I can't remember the title of it. Those are really go-to kind of workbooks for elementary school kids. For anxious kind of preschoolers, I like more metaphorical books, Owl Babies, um, uh, The Kissing Hand. And as a general book for anxiety, Who's Got Dragons by Nicolas Cage. I like that book because it talks about personifying anxiety, but it doesn't end up with your child in the child at the end of the book ending in a therapist's office. It leaves a lot of wiggle room and a little bit of room for imagination. With middle school, there's the Dawn Hubner book. That's more tricky in terms of kind of books that kind of work. And I also might turn to YA fiction, actually, because virtue of YA fiction is that they can read a book in which they can see I'm not alone. And YA fiction's been particularly important for issues around gender identity and the like. Those books have been, in my opinion, kind of lifesavers in terms of children seeing, hey, I'm not alone, and normalizing it. So, the TV show Heartstopper and the kind of graphic novel, a lot of appeal because of its kind of normalizing of that relationship. But I find with middle school for me and high school, it's have to poke around a little bit more individually. But I'd love to know what other people's other thoughts are.
Some of my favorites these days are Hey Warrior and Hey Awesome by Karen Young. They're really marvelous. Highly recommend them. Hey Warrior and Hey Awesome by Karen Young.
Great.
I think you said this one, Worry Says What by Allison Edwards.
I didn't.
Oh, it's a really good one. It talks about worry coming out at night. And then I have, you shared, I think, When My Worries Get Too Big, the Don't Worry book by Todd Parr, even though I always would recommend to not say don't worry to your kiddo, but it is kind of a sweet little book. I love his stuff. Wemberly Worried is an oldie but a goodie. I Can Do Hard Things by Gabby Garcia is also one of my new favorites.
That's great. Those are a bunch I haven't heard of. Great.
I wrote some down too.
Yeah, I was writing.
I love books. I wasn't thinking so much about books that are about worry, but just that normalize. So I love the book Mean Soup, which is about a bad day, about a mom and a kid storing away a bad day. And I like Alexander's Very Bad, Terrible, No Good Day, even in Australia. I think that can become a great phrase to have around the house. Like, oh, yeah, it's that kind of day. They happen even in Australia. On we go. That's a classic. And I was thinking also about a new book that I found that's really fun. That's called Not a Cat, a memoir. It's just about all the different ways we are. I like those, like Not a Cat, and Dr. Seuss has a one that's about all the colors that we are. Just about kind of like, yeah, we have so many different ways that we can be, and worried is one of them. But there's other ones too. And some days are just like that. They're worry days, and other days are others. So I like that Not a Cat, and the My Many Colored Days is the Dr. Seuss one.
Great.
Thank you. Any other remaining comments before we close tonight?
Well, no, well, thank you so much for, dropping in on your busy Sunday afternoons and taking time for this. And thanks to Hannah and Dana and Susanna for taking time out too.
Yes, thank you all, 4 of you. We really appreciated you joining us this evening and giving us a lot of sound advice and helping all our families.